Hey everyone, it's Jimmy from Internal here, and today I'm going to show you how to build a simple approval queue tool. In this case, we are approving images, and you can see that as you click on various items in this table, new images appear, and you can then approve them if they look good, or if you want to, you can give a reason for the denial. And we've also included a little table here that lets you see what you've been processed and actually lets you resubmit items in order to reprocess them or in case errors were made. So let's take a look at how we built this. Okay, let's first start off with a new space. You can create one by clicking Create New Space in the left sidebar. Now let's go ahead and add our first component, which is going to be a table. This table component will display the submitted images data, which resides in the database. So we're going to pick our demo database as the data source and use the function to list image submissions records. So these functions are all auto-generated by internal once you connect to a data source. So the next thing we want to do, let's change the name of this table to submissions, make it a little bit simpler. And now let's clean up our table a little bit by hiding some columns we don't need to show here, like the ID or the reason, since it's going to be blank at this stage. Let's also hide status and updated at, because those aren't relevant here currently. Also, in order to make our table look a little bit nicer, let's add an icon to the priority column to distinguish the various priorities visually. So just click on the priority field, select an icon, and then type in the display value as well as the underlying value, and then associate that with an icon. So let's go ahead and quickly do this for both possible values for priority here. And lastly, let's add a filter. So for this table, we only want to show items that need to be reviewed. In order to do that, let's create a new filter and then set the status to be equal to submitted. Now, once we do this, this table will only show the items that have the submitted status and are ready for review. All right. Next thing we want to do is add our image component. So let's go ahead and place it on the right side next to our table. And let's go into configuration. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to construct the URL of the image we want to display. In this case, all of our images are in a private S3 bucket, so let's just add the URL there. Now in order to complete the URL and identify the correct image, we want to insert a variable that will point at the image file name, which will complete the URL. So let's click Insert a Variable, and let's choose to take it from the submissions table. Let's use the selected row and the data within that row, and the column that we want is called image file. This contains the image file name, which will allow us to complete the URL so that whenever someone clicks on a row in this table, this allows us to display the correct image. Now let's name this image component image submitted. And since this is a private S3 bucket, we want to sign it with our bucket's credentials so that we're able to show images. Now, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and add another table. This table is going to contain all of the item submissions that we had already processed. So we're going to go ahead and choose that same demo database. We're also going to choose to list the same image submissions records. Let's go ahead and name this the processed table. And let's also hide some columns that we don't need. So let's hide ID. Let's hide priority since it isn't relevant at this stage since it's already been processed. And then let's hide submitted at. However, we do want to show the reason as well as the status. So next thing, let's go ahead and add a filter just to be able to distinguish better between the two tables that we have. And so in this case, what we want to do is the opposite of the first table, where as long as the status is not equal to submitted, that means it's either been approved or denied. Those are all of the records that we want to show in this table. Let's also go ahead to status, and another way you can make items look nicer is to use a pillbox. They work similarly to icons. In this case, you put the display value as well as the actual underlying value, and you associate it with a color. And you can see that approved is now changed to be a pillbox. Now let's start adding some of the buttons for users to interact with the tool. Let's go and place two buttons. These are going to serve as our approve and deny buttons. And let's also add a filter component, and let's start configuring this first. So this filter component is going to give us is going to contain the reason for denial. So let's just call it reason. Give it some placeholder text so that users know what to put in there. And now let's configure the actions that we want our buttons to take. So this first button, we also want it to act on that same demo database. And we want it to update image submissions records. So let's make this the approve button. And let's start configuring how we want to get the values for each of the fields. So for the ID value, we want that to come from a component. Let's have it come from the submissions table so that whenever a user selects a row in that table, the ID of that submission is what we're going to have this button be bound to. The next thing that we also want in our fields is the status field. So let's go and choose the status field. And in this case, we want to set it to a custom default value. So we want to set the status to approved so that whenever you click on this button, it's going to find the ID of what's selected in that table. And then it's going to change the status field to approved. So let's hop on over to the effects tab now. And one of the things that we want this button to do after a user has clicked it is we want it to refresh components. In this case, both the submissions table and the process table should be refreshed so that you can see the new data and any changes that might have occurred once the button is clicked. So now let's go ahead and do a similar thing for the other button, which will be the deny button. Choose the same demo database as well as the function to update image submissions records. Let's call this deny. And similarly, we're going to take the ID value from the submissions table. And then let's also change the status once again. And this time, when we configure our custom default value, we want this value to now be denied. And finally, one last thing for the deny button, we also want this to update the reason field. So let's go ahead and add the reason field here to this button. And in this case, we want the reason value to come from a component. So this case, it'll be the reason filter component. So let's just choose the value now. So now whatever is input into the reason filter component is what's going to be updated in the reason field when you click this button. So we also want to go over to effects and have this button refresh both tables similarly. Finally, let's go ahead and add an inline button to our processed table. So what this button is going to do is it's going to allow us to resubmit an item, allowing us to move it back up to be reprocessed. So let's go to the columns within the process table and add a component, which was going to be a button. And let's choose the same demo database and the update image submissions record function. We're going to label this button to be the resubmit button. And here we want to use the ID from a component. But since this is an inline button, we can use the ID from this row in this particular table. Let's go ahead and select that. And now the other thing that we want this to do is we want it to change the status. So let's change the status field. Let's set this to be a custom default value, and let's enter in submitted as the value. So now once this is done, we're all set up. Go ahead and save and publish your tool. And you can see that we have now created that same tool that we were showcasing at the start of this video. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.